context, looking at Britain and the United States. So that makes for some interesting, I think, connections for the work that we'll be doing today. Over the course of our time together, I will be meeting with you today, this afternoon, and then again on Wednesday in the evening, and on Thursday in the evening. And during that time, we'll have a chance to really dig into the work that you've been thinking about from the professor pack that we sent, right? In terms of the focus on the syllabi. Just by way of preparation, I can tell you that we will work on the syllabi that you've already created. We'll build upon, we'll reflect, we'll have opportunity to share. And a few of you very kindly came up to me and said, well, I'm almost done with this, I'm not so sure about that. Rest assured, we're here really just to support and to enable and share. It's not to be evaluated in any way. It's not a mark against anyone's character. I mean, it's just we just want to see your work and to support you in it as you roll it out and so my role will be to help to facilitate that process by helping to make connections so that you can work individually, in groups, and also in consultation with various other ones of us as you develop the syllabus. One thing I would ask you to think about very, very deeply is that the idea that the syllabus that you're preparing and that you have already prepared in some parts for the coming year is a work in progress for the duration of the time that we're at ISGAP. Right? That is that we are hoping that you will return to it, massage it, tweak it as you engage new meanings and understandings and challenges and contradictions, that you will use the syllabus daily as something that you will return to. Does that make sense? As kind of a work in progress, as opposed to it's like we did it and now it's done. Because if you're like me, you might forget really important things if you don't return to them quickly. And that's again one of the reasons why we want to return even to the idea of the film. So if you'll just keep that in mind, that you'll return to your syllabus throughout the time that we're here. I would invite you to do that almost daily as you think about, yeah, I remember, when Charles was speaking, he mentioned that Emmanuel guy, and the quote, and maybe that's the one I want to reference in my work, right? Or maybe a reference to the film or something such as that. What we will do also is engage your pedagogy and explore some very specific strategies which we believe can be helpful to the university classroom. Most of us are very much accustomed to the traditional lecture format, but in a changing world, in a world which is increasingly high-tech, and in some ways more constructivist, a little bit more metacognitive, there are ways in which we may modify the university classroom in such a way that it reflects those new realities. And those are conversations I would invite us to have for the time that we are together. What that will mean is that there are a few discrete strategies which I will share with you. I've been a professional staff developer for a couple of decades. So I've worked with teachers, professors, principals, superintendents, university administrators in terms of curricula and the infusion of literacy skills in the curriculum. And a lot of times we don't, as university instructors, think very much about literacy. But if we think about it in terms of making meaning in interesting and engaging ways, in ways which the brain likes, based on what we know now about the brain that we didn't know 30 or 40 years ago, then that might invite us to do things a little bit differently in the classroom. So those are a few things that we're going to encourage you to do as well. So we're going to ask you a couple of times over the course of the week to practice being a little bit uncomfortable with being uncomfortable. Okay, and I'll share with you a little bit more what that will look like by way of a few very discrete strategies. I'll tell you just briefly, one of them is going to be called TAPS, T-A-P-P-S. Let's think aloud, paired problem solving. It's a very interesting strategy which can be used in a university classroom very quickly to get students in and out of problem solving in a very dynamic way to break something up in the classroom. I will go through that in more detail later. This is just by way of overview. Another strategy which we will explore is something called the group process protocol, and that will engage students in kind of roundtable discussions with particular guidelines for that. And we will look at something called the flipped classroom, ways in which a teacher or a professor may engage students in a truly novel way. A flipped classroom very often has students doing in the classroom what students very often would do at home, and doing at home what students would very often do in the classroom. And there are rationales for that that we'll get into as well. And they have a lot to do with novelty and learning. So you might ask yourself, well, why are we talking about pedagogy? I mean, after all, this is ISGAP. Well, why are we talking explicitly about pedagogy? Well, I would say that it's very much married to ISGAP's purpose as well, which is not only to engage scholarship and scholars in the meaningful concerns of contemporary anti-Semitism globally, but it is also designed to help to reach and engage students and to broaden that category of students who will attend to our classes, who will attend to the subject, who will be excited about it and find meaning in it. And one of the ways that we can do that is to reach them in the various ways in which they learn, which will mean sometimes variation in the way that we teach. And it will also mean thinking about multiple intelligence theory and other ways in which we as learners and thinkers tend to make meaning. We'll look at theory as well and allow that to guide us in terms of the way that we make different applications in the classroom. So let me ask you, we haven't heard Moshe. Any questions or thoughts at the moment? Yeah.
From a Steve Sussman.
Steve.
From a process point of view, you mentioned the flipped classroom.
Right.
I thought you were leaning toward online education, which seems to be some of us teach in programs that offer online alternatives.
Right.
So I'm looking not just at the classroom, the face-to-face or brick and mortar, but the online. And I built my syllabus, in a sense, to do either or.
Excellent, excellent. And that really gets at the heart of the matter, too, because of how much the classroom, that's a perfect example of how much the classroom has changed. So yes, we are looking at ways, and ISGAP has considered and is exploring ways of going online with some of the instruction, and Charles and I will share that with you as we go forward over the course of time. But interestingly, we're talking also just about ways in which one uses video, right? Ways in which one uses text, and how does one even begin to look at the idea of text? So often we have been accustomed to thinking of text as a written word, but many teachers of language and literacy, of course, invite us to consider that, well, you know, we might expand and really ought to expand the way that we look at text. It's not just a written word, but it's also visual, and that's also auditory. Now we know that, and teachers have, you know, forever shown the film in classrooms and things like that. But what we want to do is be a little bit more intentional and a little bit more strategic in terms of ways in which we use listening, the ways in which we use viewing, and we can get a lot of power from using small clips sometimes rather than using something in total as well. So there are very interesting conversations we can have about that. You might notice in the template that was included in your professor pack, and of course we told you feel free to use your own format from your syllabi, and I've seen from the various ones that were already sent that you did that, and at the same time you did try to incorporate what we shared. One of the interesting things that I think you may have found in it was that we listed this thing called RVLs, right? We said reading, viewing, and listening, just to help you, not so much that you have to put RVL in your syllabi, but that you ask yourself, that you remind yourself almost, well, have I created opportunities in my syllabus for listening? Is there a speech? Or is there a talk? Is there an interview that I could actually assign that would be really relevant in this unit? And similarly, is there a film, or is there a clip? Is there a segment? Is there an interview? Is there something visual that I can use? And it might even be visual to the extent that it's not a moving image. It may be something that some of us have done, which is to send students to a museum, right? And say, look, this is part of the reading, as it were. So just to help us, because we often, teachers tend to, one of the things I've learned from working with teachers most of my professional life is that teachers tend to teach the way they were taught. And we are, those of us sitting in the august halls of Oxford as scholars and residents and professors and such, are, I would argue, the survivors, right, of a certain style of teaching. We in the American South, we would say, sit and get it. That you sit and you get it, right? And that the professor tells you, and we were the ones who got the A's. We took our notes and we listened, and others who were as bright didn't learn that way, and they're not here with us. And so this is one of the things that I want to invite us to think about, is what are the ways in which we can diversify our instruction such that we actually get students who might not otherwise be in our classroom. Say, I never thought of you taking another course in global anti-Semitism, but I'm taking it. Right? So what can we do in order to expand that network? All right, so I just want to leave you with that for a minute, then we'll kind of ebb and flow.
So are there any questions for Carlton, or comments in general? So feel free, we're small enough groups. All right, so I think what I will do is begin the lecture. We're going to stop at around 11:30?
No, coffee break is at 10:30.
At 10:30. Like I said, at 10:30. So it's now 10 past 10. Okay, so I'm going to start my comments on contemporary anti-Semitism. So I have a question for you. Could you imagine in 2016 a research center at Oxford, or the Ivy Leagues, that calls for the extermination of a group of people? That its philosophical foundations would perceive a group of people as unclean, as descending from animals and from apes and pigs. Could you imagine a research center under the leadership and support of an ideology or a worldview that would claim that sort of thing in 2016? Does anybody? Okay. So I'm going to show you a clip of Sheikh Kawadari. Does everybody know who Sheikh Kawadari is? So Sheikh Kawadari, for those who don't know, is a cleric. He's an important spiritual leader of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood that has had and has significant influence around the world. I'd say in particular in the United States, in the United Kingdom, but certainly in places like North Africa, in Egypt. You could argue that it may be the sort of intellectual underpinnings of Islamism, that this is sort of the foundation, and there were branches of the roots of the Muslim Brotherhood that went off into different directions, into Wahhabism, even the Shiite Iranian revolutionary regime. Eddie's looking at me, he does work on this, that the Shiite revolutionary regime in Iran owes its ideological and theological foundation to some extent to the Muslim Brotherhood. So a very influential movement. It starts in the early 1900s as a reaction in part to British colonialism, and it takes from Europe the most pernicious forms of European anti-Semitism. I think that in a sense that I would argue that anti-Semitism is very much a European phenomenon, and I'll explain later, but a phenomenon that is inherently genocidal. And scholars like Bassam Tibi and Jeffrey Herf and others show how the Islamists, the Muslim Brotherhood, took European anti-Semitism and fused it with their brand of Islam. And what is core to the Brotherhood and Islamism is they took, in a sense, the protocols of the Elders of Zion. Do people know what the protocols of the Elders of Zion is? Some do, some don't. So the protocols of the Elders of Zion is a forged, fake document that emerges in the late 1800s. Some argue in France, some argue in Russia. And it's the sort of, it purports to be the notes of a meeting of a group of Jews coming together to secretly conspire to take over the world, to control the world, and to spread their tentacles of control and corruption. And in a sense, it's this document and this lie that played a key role, I would argue, in the Holocaust. It played a key role in legitimizing the subjugation, the removal of Jews from European society. It dehumanized them. It played a key role in distancing society from them. And as Elie Wiesel and others say, that the Holocaust didn't start with crematoriums and railroad tracks, but it began with words and ideas. And it's these words and ideas that plays an important role in the terrain, the landscape, leading up to the Holocaust. And today, in the Islamic world, these lies, this text, is now not only the underpinnings, the foundation of radical Islamist thought, not Islam and not Muslims, but radical political Islam. It's the underpinnings of their thought, and in many places like Egypt, like Jordan, and other parts of the world, it's now the first or second most read text in these societies. And these ideas are now not just in the being taught in the mosques and Friday sermons, or part of the theology that is growing rapidly, but has now entered into the sort of political and popular culture in many societies. It's part of music, it's part of film and television. So I'm just going to show you this. So Sheikh Karadari played a key role. He's a key thinker in the Muslim Brotherhood. He's the head of the Kuwaiti Foundation, or plays a big role in the Kuwaiti Foundation. And Ira, how do I...
The link is already open on the top of the page.
Thank you. So Karadari, he was the president of the Board of Trustees of Oxford University's Islamic Studies Department, or Islamic Studies Institute. So he plays a key role in not only the Muslim Brotherhood, and not only in Egypt. He was invited right after the revolution. He came to give an important speech in Cairo. His representatives in the United States of America, basically CARE, visited the White House 340 times in the past year. It's astounding. And this is the man who, whoops, I can't enlarge it.
2 hours now.
Right.
This one?
The next one, very next one, right there.
Cool. Thank you. Ira, do you know this one?
Just click on those arrows. The other button.
The right button?
The left button.
Okay.
طوال التاريخ من يؤدبه نتيجة إفساده. آخر تأديب كان تأديب هتلر، ما فعل بهم وإن كانوا بالغوا في الأمر ما بلغوا، ولكن استطاع أن يعني يوقفهم عند حدودهم، وكان هذا أدبا إلهيا، تأديبا إلهيا، عقابا قدريا لهؤلاء. والمرة القادمة إن شاء الله ستكون على أيدي المؤمنين. كل ما أتمناه في ختام كلمتي هذا أن يهيئ الله لي في ختام حياتي فرصة للذهاب إلى أرض الجهاد والمقاومة على كرسي متحرك، فأطلق رصاصة على أعداء الله اليهود، ويطلقون علي قنبلة أختم بها حياتي بالشهادة، وأقول الحمد لله رب العالمين، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
This is the founding head of Islamic Studies at Oxford, the most important cleric in the Sunni world, and a cleric, the head of a movement, the spiritual head of a movement that in the first tour of the current American administration, they went to Al-Azhar University in Cairo, invited the Muslim Brotherhood as distinguished guests of the President of the United States of America for the approach of engagement. So the question we have is, how is it possible, 2008, 2016, that Western countries, not just the United States, but Western countries came to engage the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamists and support them and aid them in the election process, support them in various parts of the Islamic world and beyond, when this ideology, the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood, clearly calls for the continuation of the work of Hitler, and that all believers are obligated to do this. So I submit to you that we as scholars need to understand the ideology and the theology of this movement, and how the Jew has come to be symbolized and understood from a religious perspective, but also the role that anti-Semitism is playing in this social movement and how it's gaining force. So I would start my comments, we have 10 minutes, I'll start in the sense that sort of putting into context in the sort of rapidly changing world that we live in. And I think, I would argue that ISGAP, it's the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy, and in my own sort of individual work and my own individual perspective, I prefer to look at globalization and anti-Semitism. Instead of global anti-Semitism, which I think is more descriptive, I try to look at issues of globalization and how the processes of neoliberal globalization, economic, social, cultural, political processes affiliated with neoliberal globalization is impacting societies around the world. Femi edited a book that I participated in on globalization and marginality many years ago, 10, 15 years ago. So this is something that I think helps to put into context this sort of rapidly changing world, and to put into a place or space where scholars can sort of try to understand what has happened. And I would say, just to sort of echo Carlton, I don't know what you call it, situationality, is that the word? So I think also just a brief introduction about myself. I'm from Montreal, and being from Montreal I think also is interesting, so I won't go into all the details, but I think Quebec society is very different from the rest of Canada and certainly the rest of North America. And to be a minority, growing up in a minority community in Quebec, in Montreal, is also unique because the Jews were the quintessential other for many generations. And we were sort of in the space between the competing founding fathers of, this is from the Canadian law, founding fathers of Confederation, the British and the French. And it's in Quebec, in the 1950s, the French sort of rose up over British, tried to rise up over British domination that lasted centuries. Both competing colonial powers had different approaches for the indigenous people. The British literally hunted the indigenous people for sport and for clearing the land. In my doctoral degree, I looked at the Biotic people. Nobody's probably heard of them, but they were the original inhabitants of Newfoundland, which was a place named by the British. And the last Biotic person died in 1829. Her name was Sawandawit, and she was the last Biotic person that lived in Newfoundland. The British wiped Newfoundland free of its indigenous people through hunting and extermination and poisoning of blankets to eliminate indigenous people disease. The French, this sort of Republican notion of assimilation was sort of the key. The French didn't enter into physical annihilation as much as they did cultural annihilation. Anyways, the British dominates Quebec. The French majority eventually starts to rise in the 1950s, 1960s in the Quiet Revolution, and the Jews are sort of in the middle, not being able to participate in Catholic, French Catholic institutions and also Anglo-Saxon Protestant institutions. So the Jewish community is unique in Montreal with sort of institutional completeness. We have, things have shifted obviously in the past few decades, but the Jewish community has its own hospitals, its own schools, its own social services. There's sections of Montreal that has the most densely populated Jewish community in the diaspora outside of Israel. The Côte Saint-Luc was a place where 96% of the inhabitants were Jewish, which is very, very high. So it's unique. So I come from that background and was, I think when you grow up in that society, it was an anti-Semitic society. Sort of the legacy of the church and the sort of competing post-colonial powers trying to vie for domination was difficult. And in the 1970s, Jews and many minorities left Quebec. I'd say 75–80% of the Jewish population of my generation left because it was French nationalism was very strong, and there weren't really spaces for English-speaking or French-speaking Jews. So most professionals, most people left, and I was one of the people that left. And I think growing up in a society like that, I was certainly aware of issues of human rights. I was involved in the rights of minorities in Quebec and started a student organization. I was active in the Hillel, I was the president of Hillel, and also became the chairperson of the student struggle for Soviet Jewry. The Soviet Jews were oppressed in the Soviet Union, and students in North America and Western Europe, and actually many women, played a key role in trying to help to liberate the Soviet Jews. In 1984, as a kid, a crazy kid, I went to Russia to visit refugees and to meet with them, and came back and was very active. And also, I think through that experience and learning about human rights and the importance of human rights, I also became very active in the anti-apartheid movement and also active in issues, indigenous issues in Canada, the rights of the indigenous people, the First Nations we call them, and also issues of racism and police brutality in Montreal against young black men, African Canadian men in the 1980s and 90s. So this was before cell phones, but we used to buy people cameras, and they used to take pictures of police interacting with people inappropriately and get pictures of them on little little Kodak disposable cameras. So things like that. I then, after Oxford, after being in South Africa, I worked with the leadership of the African National Congress, and I was in South Africa for long periods of time, relative long periods of time, as an observer and helping opposition organizations. Was very active in that, spent time there. That's a whole long story. But to make a long story short, when I came to Israel, I moved to Israel in the mid-90s as sort of this progressive, British-educated, critical scholar. The Soviet Union had fallen, apartheid was coming to an end, and I think a lot of us at those moments felt like anything was possible, including peace between Israelis and Palestinians. And I was involved in a group of scholars, of Israeli and Palestinian scholars that would meet. We'd often meet in Jerusalem and in Ramallah, and we would actually go and hear music with Arnie Lawrence. If anybody remembers Arnie Lawrence was an American jazz player who played with Miles Davis, and he would teach young Israelis and Palestinians music. So his band would play for us Thursday nights in this restaurant in Ramallah, and we'd play Friday in Jerusalem. And there was a lot of movement for peace. But I remember in 1987, I met one of the professors, a Palestinian professor, and I would argue. And usually when you study social theory and you hang out in Oxford and meet all the characters that come in and out of here, you can usually figure out who somebody is, if they're right wing, if they're left wing, if they're religious, if they're secular, if they're postmodernist, if they're libertarian. You kind of get where they're coming from. And this guy was saying stuff that I couldn't believe he was saying what he was saying. So we would argue. And around the third or fourth time that we met, I asked him, and he was a very nice man, very cultured, very warm guy, but saying the most bizarre things about democracy, about Jews, about women, about the civil rights movement in the United States. So I started to ask him for things to read, because our conversations were going nowhere. It was just complete, no communication. And to make a long story short, I started to read about the Muslim Brotherhood and radical political Islam. And I went to really good universities, in theory anyways. I went to McGill, I went to the University of London and Oxford. And I never heard, and I studied political science and social theory, I never heard of this. I didn't know about this. So I sort of devoured everything that was available to me in English. And this was obviously a huge gap in my education, and I think it's a huge gap in our education. But I started to realize in the late 90s that given globalization, which I'll explain my view of it in a moment, and sort of this ideology that I thought had arrived at the appropriate time, that there was not going to be peace. If you remember, in the late 1990s, the world was very excited at the prospect, the very good prospect, that the Israelis and Palestinians were going to have peace. And I was very much in favor of that. I still am in favor of that. But I began to tell my colleagues in Israel and here in the United Kingdom that this is not going to have a happy ending. Because here we have a reactionary social movement that is anti-Semitic, sexist, homophobic, anti-moderate Muslim, anti-democratic, and these guys are ascending and these guys are serious. So of course, my comrades here who knew me from the anti-apartheid movement and knew me from the seminars at Oxford on racism and the like, couldn't understand what I was talking about. And of course I became, in their mind, reactionary, anti-peace, and neo-conservative, and perhaps racist and anti-Palestinian and Islamophobic, because I was saying that this is not going to have a happy ending. So a lot of my comrades broke with me right there and then, and sadly, many other people broke with me. And the story of this sort of intellectual isolation is not my story. I think those of us who engage this issue have lost many friends, And if you look back historically, from Raymond Aron to other intellectuals, I think of Walter Benjamin and Sholem and others, who started to engage issues of anti-Semitism and issues of Jewish self-determination, and they were also historically, Wilhelm Reich and others, and Césaire, that's another story. People who began to look at these issues seriously were often sort of mugged and dismissed by their progressive intellectual colleagues. So I think we've arrived at a moment where I think Jewish intellectuals, the few of us who have engaged this issue, and I say Jewish intellectuals intentionally, have had a rough road for the last 15 years. But I think now we've reached a moment where I think people are beginning to realize that this is something is happening. What it is ain't exactly clear. Something is happening, and I think that this is something that poses a challenge to all of us who care about human rights, but intellectuals who try to understand what is happening, what are the processes occurring in society. I think, and I think judging by the diversity of this crowd and other groups that are beginning to engage this issue, I think it's a good sign. It's late in the hour, but it's great that we're coming together to discuss this issue. And I think the fascinating thing and the challenging thing about contemporary anti-Semitism, but perhaps the interesting thing is if you dig deep into it intellectually, it really touches on the complexities and the contradictions of many, many issues. It's not just about the Jews and Israel. It's really about a wide variety of issues that ought to, and I believe concerns the people in this room and other intellectuals. So I'm going to end it there. We have tea. Michelle will tell you where, and then we'll come back to resume the talk.
Tea is where we had breakfast on the main floor.